They thought she was dying. Security footage captured the mistress smirking in the hospital waiting room, texting her lover, "Is it over yet?" 6 months in a coma. Her husband divorced her while she was unconscious, married his mistress, stole her newborn twins, took everything, but Claire Hartley woke up, and she wasn't alone. Her best friend, the one everyone thought was dead, had been watching from the shadows. Together, they would dismantle the empire built on her stolen life. This is a story about survival, revenge, and a mother's unbreakable will. If you love stories where justice catches up with the villain, hit that like button, drop a comment with your prediction, and subscribe because you won't want to miss how this ends. Let's begin. The security camera footage was grainy but clear enough. Timestamp 6:43 p.m., November 14th, location St. Margaret's Hospital, Greenwich, Connecticut. A woman sat alone in the sterile waiting room, her designer heels crossed at the ankles, a Chanel bag resting on her lap. Savannah Cross, 29 years old, blonde hair styled in perfect waves, skin glowing under the fluorescent lights. She checked her phone, and her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was colder than that, more calculated. Her phone buzzed. She read the message, and that cold expression deepened into something darker. A smirk, slow and venomous, like poison spreading through clear water. The text was from Preston Hartley. "She's not waking up. Doctors say it's bad. Might be permanent." Savannah's thumb hovered over the screen. She typed back, "How long until we know for sure?" 3 floors above her, in the intensive care unit. Claire Hartley lay motionless. Tubes snaked from her arms. Machines beeped in steady rhythm. And somewhere in the chaos of wires and monitors, 2 tiny cribs held her newborn twins, a boy and a girl. Ethan and Grace, 6 hours old and already motherless. But Claire wasn't dead. Not yet. The camera footage continued rolling. Savannah stood, smoothed her pencil skirt, and walked to the elevator with the confidence of someone who had already won. The doors closed, and the timestamp moved forward. 6 months later, Claire's eyes snapped open. The room was different, smaller. The machines were gone except for one monitor that beeped softly near her head. Sunlight streamed through vertical blinds, cutting harsh lines across white sheets. Her body felt wrong, heavy, weak, like she'd been hollowed out and poorly reassembled. A nurse appeared, her face going pale. "Oh my God, you're awake! You're actually awake!" Claire tried to speak, but her throat was sandpaper. The nurse pressed a button, spoke urgently into a phone, and within minutes the room filled with people, doctors, specialists, a neurologist who kept shining lights in her eyes and asking her to follow his finger. "What year is it?" someone asked. Claire's voice cracked. "Where are my babies?" The neurologist exchanged glances with another doctor. "Mrs. Hartley, you've been in a medically induced coma for 6 months. We need to run some tests before we can discuss anything else." "Where are my babies?" Claire repeated, louder this time. "Where are Ethan and Grace?" Nobody answered. Over the next 72 hours, Claire learned what 6 months could destroy. Her twins were alive and healthy, living in her Greenwich mansion with their father and his new wife. Preston had divorced Claire on grounds of abandonment and mental incompetence while she was unconscious. A judge had granted, the same judge who later awarded him full custody because Claire, according to medical evaluations Preston's lawyers had provided, was unable to care for herself, let alone 2 infants. Savannah Cross was now Savannah Hartley. She'd married Preston in a quiet ceremony 4 months ago. The society pages had called it romantic, a widower finding love again while caring for his motherless children. Except Claire wasn't dead. She was here, sitting in a hospital bed, reading her own obituary and archived news articles her father had reluctantly shown her. "They thought you wouldn't wake up," Frank Hartley said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. He'd aged a decade in 6 months. Gray streaked his hair, and new lines carved deep around his mouth. "The doctors gave us less than a 5% chance. Preston had power of attorney for medical decisions. He could have kept you on life support indefinitely, but he chose to start weaning you off medications. His lawyers argued it was more humane to let you go naturally." Claire's mother, Eleanor, sat in the corner, tissue pressed to her eyes. "We fought him, sweetheart. We spent everything we had on lawyers. But Preston's family has connections. Old money, judges in their pockets. We couldn't win." So they just took my children? Claire's voice broke. While I was unconscious, they stole my life. Frank reached for her hand. When you wake up, we'll fight again. We'll get them back. But the way he said it, the defeat in his eyes, told Claire what he wouldn't say out loud. Preston Hartley had won. Claire stared at the magazine photo her father had brought. There they were, Preston in a navy suit, looking distinguished with his salt and pepper hair, Savannah in cream silk, glowing with the confidence of someone who'd successfully stolen another woman's life. And between them, in a designer double stroller, two beautiful 6-month-old babies. The caption read, Preston and Savannah Hartley, American pharmaceutical power couple. The Hartleys are the proud parents of twins Ethan and Grace, and lead the groundbreaking Hartley Pharmaceuticals into a new era. Claire memorized Savannah's face. That same smirk from the hospital security footage, barely hidden behind a practiced smile. They thought she was dying. They were wrong. 8 months earlier, Claire's life had been different. Perfect. Even from the outside. The Hartley mansion sat on 3 acres in Greenwich, a sprawling colonial with white pillars and black shutters that belonged on a magazine cover. Claire had loved that house once. She'd spent 2 years decorating it, choosing every paint color, every piece of furniture, imagining the family they'd build there. She'd been Claire Morrison then, a rising star at Morrison and Associates, one of Connecticut's most prestigious law firms. Corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, the kind of high-stakes negotiations that paid 7 figures and demanded 80-hour weeks. She'd been good at it, brilliant, according to her mentors. Then she'd met Preston Hartley at a charity gala. He was handsome, charming, came from pharmaceutical royalty. His family's company, Hartley Pharmaceuticals, had been developing life-saving drugs for 3 generations. Preston was the golden heir, taking over as CEO after his father's retirement. Their courtship was whirlwind, 6 months of expensive dinners, weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard, and promises of a future that glittered like the diamond ring he'd eventually placed on her finger. They married in a ceremony that cost more than most people's houses. Claire left her law career to focus on family. Preston wanted children right away. And at 33, Claire's biological clock was ticking. She got pregnant with twins on their first try. For a while, it was perfect. Then, 7 months into her pregnancy, Claire found the earring. It was small, delicate, expensive. A diamond stud caught in the sheets of their bed, on Preston's side. Claire stood there holding it, feeling the weight of something much heavier than the jewelry itself. She'd seen Savannah cross before, at company events, always hovering near Preston, laughing too hard at his jokes. She was the vice president of communications at Hartley Pharmaceuticals, young, ambitious, beautiful in that calculated way that came from personal trainers and dermatologists. Claire confronted Preston that night. It's nothing, he'd said, not even bothering to look up from his laptop. Savannah was here for a meeting. She must have dropped it. A meeting in our bedroom. Don't be paranoid. Claire, pregnancy hormones are making you irrational. That word, irrational, he'd use it again and again over the coming weeks, weaponizing her pregnancy against her. Any concern she raised was hormones. Any question was paranoia. Any boundary she tried to set was controlling behavior. Claire was a lawyer. She knew gaslighting when she saw it, but she was also 7 months pregnant with twins. Her body increasingly unwieldy, her options shrinking by the day. She hired a private investigator. The photos came back within a week. Preston and Savannah at hotels. Preston and Savannah at her apartment. Preston and Savannah in his car, parked in dark corners of parking garages. The affair had been going on for at least a year. Claire sat in her lawyer's office. The evidence spread across a mahogany desk, and made a decision. She would wait until after the babies were born. Then she would divorce him, take half of everything, and ensure her children never wanted for anything. She didn't know Preston was making his own plans, plans that required her to be out of the way, permanently, the night of the charity gala. Claire was 8 months pregnant and exhausted. She hadn't wanted to go, but Preston insisted. Appearance mattered. He'd said, the company was going public soon. They needed to look united. Claire wore a navy maternity gown that cost $3,000 and made her feel like a whale. She smiled for photos, made small talk with donors, and tried not to notice how Preston's hand kept reaching for his phone. At 9:30 p.m., She excused herself to the bathroom. That's when she overheard the phone call. Preston stood in the hallway near the coat check, his voice low but clear. Just a few more months. Savannah, once the babies are born and she signs the trust paperwork, we can move forward with the plan. Claire's blood went cold. The lawyers drew up the documents. Preston continued. Medical power of attorney, conservatorship papers, everything. If anything happens during delivery, I'll have complete control. And if nothing happens naturally, well, we have options. If nothing happens naturally, Claire's hands went to her stomach, protective and terrified. He wasn't just planning to leave her. He was planning something worse. She turned to leave, to get out of that building and away from the man she'd married. But her body had other ideas. The first contraction hit like a freight train. Claire doubled over, gasping. Her water broke, warm fluids soaking her dress and pooling on the marble floor. Preston appeared, all concerned husband now. Someone call an ambulance. My wife's in labor. The next hours were a blur of pain and fear. The ambulance ride, the emergency room, doctors shouting medical terms she couldn't process. Something was wrong, Brabon. The babies were in distress. Placental abruption, emergency cesarean section. The last thing Claire remembered before the anesthesia pulled her under was Preston's face above hers, and the anesthesiologist, Dr. Gerald Moss, adjusting something on her IV line. Dr. Moss glanced at Preston. Preston gave the smallest nod. Then everything went black. Claire's twins were born at 11:47 p.m. Ethan first, 5 pounds 6 ounces, screaming with healthy lungs. Grace followed 3 minutes later, 5 pounds 2 ounces, quieter but equally perfect. The surgical team worked efficiently, stitching Claire closed while the babies were cleaned and evaluated. Standard procedure, routine, even for an emergency cesarean. Except it wasn't routine. Claire should have woken up in recovery within an hour. Instead, her blood pressure dropped, then dropped again. Monitors screamed warnings. Her heart rate became erratic. She's hemorrhaging, a nurse shouted. Doctors rushed back in. They found internal bleeding, more extensive than the initial surgery suggested. They operated again, trying to find the source. By the time they stabilized her, Claire had lost nearly half her blood volume. But that wasn't what put her in a coma. Brain hypoxia, the neurologist explained to Preston hours later. Her brain was deprived of oxygen during the hemorrhaging. We've induced a medical coma to reduce swelling and give her brain time to heal. It could be days or weeks before we know the extent of the damage. Mushy Preston stood in his ICU, looking down at his unconscious wife. To the nurses, he appeared devastated. A young father, baby's just hours old, wife fighting for her life. Nobody saw the relief in his eyes. Dr. Gerald Moss found Preston in the hallway 3 days later. The dosage was adjusted as you requested, Moss said quietly. The oxygen deprivation will be attributed to the hemorrhaging. There's no way to prove otherwise. Preston handed him an envelope. The rest of your payment. And Dr. Moss, we never had this conversation. Moss pocketed the envelope and disappeared. Preston's lawyer, Marcus Dalton, was a predator in a 3-piece suit. He'd built his career on exploiting legal gray areas, finding loopholes that shouldn't exist. He arrived at the hospital with a briefcase full of documents. The medical power of attorney is clear, Dalton explained. As her husband, you make all decisions regarding her care. If she remains in a coma for 30 days, we can petition for conservatorship. That gives you control of her assets, her trust fund, everything. And the children, Preston asked. Already done. Birth certificates list you as father, her as mother. But if she's incapacitated, you're the sole guardian. No court will question it. Preston nodded. What is about her parents? Frank and Eleanor Morrison have no legal standing. They can visit, but they can't challenge your medical decisions. Not without proof you're acting against Claire's interest. And we've documented everything as concerned care. It was perfect. Almost, Claire's parents did try to fight. Frank Morrison hired a lawyer, demanded a second medical opinion, insisted Claire be transferred to a different hospital, but every request was blocked. Preston had legal authority. Preston had doctors who agreed with his treatment plan. Preston had paperwork showing he was acting in his wife's best interest. The medical legal system so perfectly designed to protect vulnerable patients, instead became the weapon that trapped Claire. Weeks turned into months. The twins grew in the NICU, then came home to the mansion. Savannah moved in to help with the babies. Preston filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment and mental incompetence. No-fault divorce in Connecticut required living separately for 18 months. But the judge made an exception given the extraordinary circumstances. Claire's medical condition deteriorated just enough to be concerning, but not fatal. The induced coma continued. Doctors suggested withdrawal of life support, but Preston insisted on trying everything. Such a devoted husband, everyone said. What they didn't know was that Preston was keeping Claire alive just long enough to complete his plan. He needed her signature on trust documents, transferred via conservatorship. He needed time for the divorce to be finalized. He needed the optics of a grieving widower, not a man who'd abandoned his comatose wife, 4 months after the twins were born. Preston married Savannah in a quiet ceremony at the mansion. Small, tasteful, appropriate for a man whose first wife was still alive but not expected to recover. The society pages ate it up, a love story born from tragedy, a man finding hope again while caring for his motherless children. 6 months after Claire's collapse, Dr. Moss adjusted her medications again, this time not to keep her under, but to allow her to wake. Preston's lawyers had assured him that even if she regained consciousness, the legal damage was done. She had no custody rights, no access to assets, no recourse, but they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated Claire Hartley. Physical therapy was torture. Claire's muscles had atrophied during 6 months of immobility. Simply sitting up left her shaking and nauseous. Walking required a walker and 2 therapists on either side, catching her when her legs gave out. But her mind was sharp. Sharper than before, perhaps, honed by rage and purpose. The hospital social worker, a kind woman named Janet, tried to prepare her gently. "Mrs. Hartley, you need to understand the legal situation before you're discharged. Your husband was granted conservatorship during your coma. He made medical decisions in your best interest. He divorced me while I was unconscious," Claire said flatly. Janet's face tightened. "Yes, the court approved it based on the length of your incapacitation and prognosis. You were married in Connecticut, where certain provisions allow for dissolution of marriage when one party is permanently disabled. I'm not permanently disabled. I'm sitting here talking to you. The legal standard at the time was different. You'd been comatose for 4 months when the petition was filed. 3 separate doctors evaluated you and concluded you were unlikely to regain meaningful consciousness. 3 doctors Preston paid for," Claire thought. "What about my children?" Janet hesitated. "Your husband has full custody. The court determined that you were unable to care for them and that separating them from their primary caregiver, your husband, would be detrimental to their well-being. Savannah Cross is not their primary caregiver. She's his mistress. She's his wife now," Janet corrected gently. "They married 4 months ago. Legally, she's their stepmother." The word hit Claire like a physical blow. Stepmother. To her babies. To the children she'd carried for 8 months. The children she'd nearly died bringing into the world. "I want to see them. You'll need to petition the court for visitation rights. Given the circumstances, a judge will likely grant supervised visits." Supervised visits. To see her own children. Claire was discharged 2 weeks later to her parents' home, the house she'd grown up in, a modest colonial in Stamford. Felt like a prison after the Greenwich mansion. Her childhood bedroom had been converted into a guest room, generic and impersonal. Frank and Eleanor had aged terribly. Her father moved slowly, his shoulders permanently hunched. Her mother's hands shook when she poured coffee. "We spent everything fighting him," Frank admitted over dinner. "The lawyers, the appeals, the medical advocates we hired. We mortgaged this house twice. I took out loans against my retirement. It wasn't enough." Claire touched his hand. "I'm going to fix this." "How?" Eleanor asked, and the hopelessness in her voice was devastating. "He has everything. The house, the money, the children, the lawyers. We have nothing." Claire stared at her reflection in the darkened window. She looked like a ghost. 30 pounds lighter than before the pregnancy. Her skin pale, her eyes hollowed out. But she wasn't dead. "I was a lawyer, Or, Claire said quietly, one of the best corporate attorneys in Connecticut. I know how these people think. I know how they operate. And I know that men like Preston get sloppy when they think they've won. She pulled out her phone, the old one her parents had saved. It still worked. She scrolled through her contacts, stopping at a name she hadn't thought about in 5 years. Damian Rhodes. They'd been friends in law school, study partners who'd pulled countless all-nighters, mock trial partners who'd dominated competitions. Damian had been brilliant, destined for greatness in securities law. Then he'd been accused of fraud. Something about insider trading at the hedge fund where he worked. The evidence was circumstantial, but the SEC investigation was damning. Damian had maintained his innocence, claimed he was being framed by his partners who needed a scapegoat. 3 weeks before his trial, Damian Rhodes died in a car crash. Single vehicle accident on a rainy night. His car went off a bridge into the Housatonic River. They never recovered the body. Claire had gone to the memorial service, watched Damian's sister, Charlotte, sob through a eulogy. She'd always suspected the crash was too convenient, too perfectly timed, but she had no proof. And soon after, she'd gotten pregnant and her life had spiraled into its own nightmare. Now, staring at Damian's name in her phone, Claire wondered. She called Charlotte Rhodes. The number was still active. It rang 4 times before someone answered. Hello, Charlotte, this is Claire Morrison. Claire Hartley now. We met at your brother's memorial service 5 years ago. A long pause. I remember you. You and Damian were friends. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Claire took a breath. Is your brother really dead? Another pause, longer this time. Why are you asking? Because I need help. The kind of help that requires someone who doesn't officially exist. Someone who knows how to fight from the shadows. Charlotte's voice dropped to a whisper. Where are you? I'll text you an address. Come alone. The address was a diner in upstate New York, 3 hours from Stamford. Claire borrowed her father's car and drove, her weak legs barely managing the pedals. Every mile felt like a risk. She was supposed to be resting, recovering. But recovery was a luxury she couldn't afford. The diner was old chrome and cracked vinyl, the kind of place where nobody asked questions. Charlotte Rhodes sat in a back booth, her face tired but alert. Next to her sat a man Claire didn't recognize. But she knew those eyes, sharp, intelligent, cautious. Hello, Claire, Damian Rhodes said. I hear you need someone who's good at fighting dirty. Damian Rhodes looked different. His dark hair was shorter, threaded with gray that hadn't been there before. He wore glasses now, thick-framed and intellectual. His face was thinner, sharper, like someone had carved away everything unnecessary. But it was him, absolutely him. You faked your death, Claire said, sliding into the booth. Her legs ached from the drive. I went into witness protection, Damian corrected. There's a difference. The fraud charges against me were manufactured by my partners at the hedge fund. They'd been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme, and I'd discovered it. Instead of letting me blow the whistle, they framed me as the mastermind. So you died. So the FBI faked my death and gave me a new identity while I helped them build a case. It took 4 years, but we got them. All 3 partners are in federal prison now, 40-year sentences. Charlotte sipped her coffee, watching Claire carefully. The witness protection officially ended 6 months ago. Damian can resume his old life, but he's chosen not to. He prefers staying dead. Why, Claire asked. Damian leaned back. Because being dead has advantages. I can work without scrutiny. I'm a forensic accountant now, specializing in corporate fraud investigations. Companies hire me under my new name, Dominic Hart, to find financial irregularities. I'm very good at it, and I don't exist in any database that matters. Claire felt something stir in her chest. Hope, maybe. I need that kind of help. I know. Charlotte told me about your situation. Your husband put you in a coma, stole your children, and married his mistress. You need to prove it and get your kids back. Can you help me? Damian pulled out a tablet, swiped through some files. I've been tracking Preston Hartley for the last 3 weeks. Since Charlotte called me. Your husband is interesting. Hartley Pharmaceuticals is preparing to go public. Their flagship drug, Zentiva, is in final FDA approval stages. It's supposed to treat autoimmune disorders, revolutionary, according to their marketing. What's the catch? The clinical trial data doesn't add up. I've looked at their public filings, cross-referencing them with hospital records and mortality databases. Zentiva has caused at least 12 deaths that weren't reported to the FDA. Preston buried the data to push the drug through approval. Claire's lawyer mind clicked into gear. That's criminal fraud. If we can prove it, we can destroy him. And get your children back, Charlotte added. A father facing a federal charges won't get custody of a goldfish, let alone twins. But we need evidence, Damien said. Real evidence, not just statistical anomalies. We need documents, emails, testimony from people involved in the cover-up. Claire thought about what she'd overheard the night she went into labor. Preston's phone call. If anything happens naturally, and we have options. He tried to kill me, Claire said quietly. Or at least keep me in a coma permanently. He bribed someone. Maybe the anesthesiologist. Dr. Gerald Moss. Damien made a note. Moss is a good target. Doctors who take bribes usually take them more than once. If we can find his financial records, we might see unusual deposits. How do we get those records? I'm a forensic accountant, Damien said with a slight smile. Finding hidden money is what I do. They talked for 3 hours. Building a strategy, Damien would investigate Hartley Pharmaceuticals, looking for the buried clinical trial data and financial fraud. Charlotte, who worked in medical records at a hospital network, would quietly search for information on Dr. Moss's past cases. Claire would focus on the custody battle, building her case for visitation rights while appearing weak and defeated. You have to look like you've given up, Damien warned. Preston needs to think he's safe. If he suspects you're investigating him, he'll bury the evidence deeper. Claire understood. She'd spent 6 months unconscious while her life was stolen. She could spend a few more months pretending to be broken. What's your success rate? She asked Damien as they prepared to leave. He met her eyes. In witness protection, I helped put away 3 criminals who thought they were untouchable. They all underestimated me because they thought I was scared. Your husband is making the same mistake. He thinks I'm helpless. Use that. Let him think he's won. Then we'll take everything from him. Claire drove back to Stamford feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose, direction, a path forward that didn't end in total despair. But first, she had to face her children. The custody hearing for visitation rights was scheduled 3 weeks later. Claire spent those weeks in physical therapy, rebuilding her strength. She needed to look capable in court, strong enough to care for 2 toddlers, even if only for supervised visits. Her lawyer, a family practice attorney named Susan Walsh, who worked pro bono through a women's rights organization, was kind but realistic. Preston's lawyers will paint you as unstable. They'll use your medical history against you. You need to stay calm no matter what they say. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, depressingly bureaucratic. Preston sat at the opposing table with Marcus Dalton and 2 junior attorneys. He wore a charcoal suit and an expression of patient concern, playing the role of reluctant participant, forced to protect his children from an unstable ex-wife. Savannah sat in the gallery, her designer outfit carefully chosen to project maternal warmth. She caught Claire's eye and smiled. That same cold smirk from the hospital security footage. Judge Victoria Brennan presided. A woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. This is a hearing to determine visitation rights for Claire Hartley, biological mother of Ethan and Grace Hartley, currently in the full custody of their father, Preston Hartley. Mrs. Hartley, you're petitioning for unsupervised visitation. Supervised would be fine, Your Honor, Susan said quickly. My client simply wants to see her children. Your Honor, Marcus Dalton stood, his voice smooth as oil. My client is not opposed to supervised visitation in principle. However, we have serious concerns about Mrs. Hartley's mental and physical stability. She was in a coma for 6 months. She's undergone significant neurological trauma. We believe additional psychiatric evaluation is necessary before any contact with the children occurs. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Dalton called a psychiatrist who'd never met Claire, but testified that coma patients often suffered personality changes and emotional instability. He called Preston, who spoke sadly about Claire's erratic behavior and concerning statements. since waking. Claire's a lawyer called Claire's the neurologist, who confirmed she'd made a remarkable recovery and showed no signs of cognitive impairment. But the damage was done. Judge Brennan's ruling was measured. I'm granting supervised visitation 2 hours per week with a court-appointed supervisor present. We'll revisit this arrangement in 3 months after Mrs. Hartley undergoes a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. 2 hours per week to see her own children. Claire nodded, accepting it. This was step one, just step one. But as she left the courtroom, she overheard Savannah talking to Preston in the hallway. 2 hours is too much. She'll confuse them. We need to make sure she can't bond with them. Preston touched her arm. Let her have her 2 hours. It keeps the judge happy. Besides, they won't remember her anyway. There are children now. Claire kept walking, her face carefully blank. But inside, something hardened into diamond-bright clarity. They'd taken her children. They'd stolen her life. And they were going to pay for every single second of it. The supervised visitation took place at a family services center, a building designed to be cheerful and welcoming, but instead felt institutional and cold. Bright primary colors on the walls couldn't hide the underlying sadness of the place, where broken families came to exchange children like packages. Claire arrived 30 minutes early. Her hands shook as she signed in. The supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Margaret, reviewed the court order and gave Claire the rules. No discussing the custody case. No speaking negatively about the father or stepmother. Any violation would end the visit immediately. They're bringing the children now, Sue, Margaret said gently. Mrs. Hartley, I should prepare you. The twins are 13 months old. They've been with their father and stepmother full time. They may not recognize you. Claire had known this intellectually, but knowing and feeling are different things. The door opened. Preston walked in carrying Ethan. Savannah held Grace. The twins had grown so much. Ethan had Preston's dark hair and serious expression. Grace was lighter, blonde like Claire, with one curious eyes. They were beautiful, perfect, and they looked at Claire like she was a stranger. Hey, guys, Preston said, his voice deliberately cheerful. This is Claire. She's going to play with you for a little while. Claire, not mommy, not even your mother, just Claire. Preston set Ethan down in the play area, and Savannah did the same with Grace. The twins immediately gravitated toward the toys, ignoring Claire completely. We'll be back in 2 hours, Preston said. He touched Savannah's arm, and they left together. The door closed with a soft click. Claire knelt on the floor, her heart hammering. Hi, Ethan. Hi, Grace. Ethan looked at her briefly, then returned to stacking blocks. Grace clutched a stuffed rabbit, watching Claire with cautious uncertainty. Margaret sat in the corner with a clipboard, observing. I brought some books, Claire said, pulling board books from her bag. Simple stories about animals and families. Would you like to read with me? Grace took a tentative step closer, interested in the bright pictures. Claire opened the book slowly, reading in a soft voice. Grace sat down next to her, still clutching the rabbit, but listening. Ethan continued playing with blocks, building and destroying towers with intense concentration. Halfway through the second book, Grace leaned against Claire's side. It was the smallest gesture, barely noticeable, but Claire felt it like an earthquake. Her daughter, touching her, trusting her, even just a little. Tears burned Claire's eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't cry. Couldn't show emotion that might be documented as instability. She read 3 more books. Grace stayed close. Ethan eventually wandered over, interested in a book about trucks. Claire read that one next, and Ethan climbed into her lap without hesitation. Children that age had no guile, no memory of betrayal. He was simply a toddler who wanted to hear about fire trucks, and she was a warm lap and a friendly voice. For 2 hours, Claire read books, built block towers, and played with toy cars. She memorized every detail. The way Ethan's hair stuck up in the back, the small birthmark on Grace's left arm, the way Grace said bunny as Bubby, and Ethan's delighted laugh when towers crashed down. When Preston and Savannah returned, Grace was showing Claire her rabbit. Bubby, she said proudly. That's a very nice bunny, Claire said, her throat tight. Savannah immediately scooped Grace up. Time to go. Sweetie, say bye-bye. Grace waved. Bye-bye. Ethan was already in Preston's arms, ready to leave. He didn't look back. The door closed. They were gone. Claire sat on the floor of the playroom, surrounded by scattered toys, and finally let herself cry. Margaret handed her tissues without comment. You did well, Margaret said quietly. They warmed up to you. That's a good sign. Claire nodded, unable to speak. She'd held her children for 2 hours. 2 hours out of 13 months. And next week, she'd get another 2 hours. And another. Building a relationship in tiny, supervised increments while Savannah got bedtimes and morning cuddles and every moment in between. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Outside, in her father's borrowed car, Claire texted Damien, had first visit with twins. They don't know me, but they will. How's your investigation? His response came quickly. Found something interesting in Hartley Pharmaceuticals' clinical trial data. We need to meet. Tonight. They met at the same upstate diner. Damien had his tablet loaded with spreadsheets and documents. Zentiva, the drug Preston's rushing through FDA approval. Damien began. The clinical trials were conducted at 5 hospitals across 3 states. I cross-referenced the participant list with death records. 12 participants died within 6 months of starting the drug. That seems high for a trial. It's astronomical for a drug that's supposed to be safe. But here's where it gets interesting. None of those deaths were reported to the FDA as adverse events. The trial documentation lists them as unrelated to drug administration due to underlying conditions. That's standard practice if the deaths truly weren't drug-related. Except I found the autopsy reports. 3 of the 12 show organ failure consistent with Zentiva's known side effects. Those should have been reported. Preston's team deliberately hid them to keep the trial moving. Claire's mind raced. That's federal fraud, falsifying FDA documents, concealing material safety data. If we can prove Preston knew about it, we can prove it. I've found emails. Damien swiped to show her. Savannah Cross, VP of Communications, received reports about the adverse events. She forwarded them to Preston with a note, handling this quietly. Documentation adjusted per your instructions. Where did you get these emails? Damien smiled slightly. I'm very good at what I do. Let's leave it at that. We need more. Emails can be claimed as forgeries or taken out of context. We need someone on the inside willing to testify. I have a lead, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, one of the clinical trial supervisors. She left Hartley Pharmaceuticals 6 months ago, right before the FDA submission. I think she knows something and got out before the scandal hit. Can you find her? Already did. She's in Oregon now, working at a small family practice. I'm flying out tomorrow to talk to her. Claire felt hope building, fragile but real. If she testifies, if we have the emails and the death records, we can blow this open. Preston will face criminal charges. He'll lose everything, including custody of your children, Damien added. A father facing federal fraud charges isn't fit to raise kids. It was perfect, almost too perfect. What's the timeline? Claire asked. I need 2 weeks to compile everything, the emails, the medical records, Walsh's testimony if she agrees to cooperate. Then we file complaints with the FDA and the SEC simultaneously. The government investigations will move quickly once they see the evidence. 2 weeks. Claire had waited 6 months already. She could wait 2 more weeks. She drove home feeling lighter than she had in months. The next visitation with the twins was in 5 days. She'd read more books, play more games, slowly become less of a stranger in their lives. And in 2 weeks, she'd start taking back everything that was stolen from her. But 3 days later, everything fell apart. The call came at 2 in the morning. Claire jerked awake, her father's old landline phone shrilling from downstairs. She stumbled out of bed, her legs still weak, and answered. Claire, it's Charlotte. Damien's sister sounded panicked. The storage facility where Damien kept the physical evidence. It burned down tonight. Everything's gone. Claire's blood went cold. What do you mean, gone? Fire started around midnight, and the whole building went up. The fire marshal is calling it arson, but they don't have suspects yet. Damien had copies of trial documents, printed emails, medical records, everything physical was in that storage unit. What about digital backups? That's why I'm calling. Damien's laptop and external hard drives were in the storage unit too. He was preparing to fly to Oregon tomorrow and wanted everything in one place. He has cloud backups, but when he tried to access them an hour ago, they were corrupted. Every single file. Claire sank into a chair. Preston found out. We don't know that for sure. Yes, we do. Someone's been in watching Damien. They knew about the storage unit. They knew about the digital backups. This is too coordinated to be coincidence. Charlotte was silent for a moment. Damien wants to talk to you. He's coming back from the scene now. 20 minutes later, Damien called. He sounded exhausted. They destroyed everything. 6 weeks of investigation. Gone. What about Dr. Walsh? You were flying to Oregon tomorrow. That's the other problem. I called her tonight to confirm the meeting. Her phone's disconnected. I had Charlotte check hospital records. Walsh resigned from her job in Oregon 2 days ago. Abrupt resignation. No forwarding address. Preston paid her off. Or threatened her. Either way, she's in the wind. Claire felt the careful hope of the last few weeks crumbling. So we have nothing. No evidence. No witness. Nothing. We have my memory of what I saw. We know the deaths happened. We know the emails existed. That's not proof. That's hearsay. No prosecutor will touch it without physical evidence. The line went quiet. They both knew what this meant. Preston had won again. Somehow, he'd discovered their investigation and systematically destroyed every piece of evidence before it could be used against him. How did he find out? Claire asked. I don't know. We were careful. I used my new identity for all the research. Charlotte only made inquiries through back channels. Unless... Damien paused. Unless what? Unless someone close to us talked. Someone who knew what we were doing. Claire's mind raced through the possibilities. Her parents didn't know details. Her lawyer Susan didn't know about Damien. The only people who knew the full scope were Claire, Damien, and Charlotte. We have a leak, Claire said. Or Preston has better surveillance than we thought. He's a CEO of a pharmaceutical company. He has resources. If he hired a security firm to watch you after you woke up from the coma... Claire looked around her parents' small house, suddenly paranoid. Are we safe? I don't think he wants to hurt you physically. The optics would be terrible, especially after your coma. But legally, financially, he's going to destroy you. He already has. Not yet. Damien's voice hardened. This was a setback, but we're not done. I can rebuild the investigation. It'll take time, but the evidence still exists out there. Deaths are on record. Trial data was submitted to the FDA. Emails live on servers somewhere. We can find it again. How long? Months, maybe a year. A year. While Preston and Savannah raised her children, while her twins grew up calling Savannah Mommy. While Claire got 2 hours per week in a supervised playroom. I don't have a year, Claire said. The next blow came fast. 2 days after the fire, Claire received notice of a lawsuit. Preston was suing her for defamation. He claimed she'd been spreading malicious lies about his business practices and character, damaging his reputation and the company's public offering. The lawsuit was clearly retaliatory, designed to drain her resources and silence her. But it was also legally sound. Claire had told her parents about the investigation. She'd mentioned the clinical trial deaths to her lawyer. If Preston's lawyers could argue those statements were made with malicious intent and caused damage, they might win. The lawsuit demanded $2 million in damages. Claire's lawyer Susan looked at the papers with dismay. This is harassment, but we have to respond. Do you have resources to fight it? I don't have resources to buy groceries, Claire said flatly. My parents mortgaged their house fighting the custody case. I have nothing. Then we need to settle. Maybe we can negotiate a retraction and an agreement to stop investigating him. He wants me silent. He wants you destroyed. Susan's voice was gentle but firm. Claire, I believe you. I believe your husband is a monster. But without evidence, we can't prove it. And this lawsuit will bankrupt your parents if we fight it. Claire understood. Preston had calculated every move. Destroy the evidence. Sue to prevent further investigation. Isolate her financially and legally until she had no choice but to surrender. 3 days later, the final blow landed. Claire arrived at the Family Services Center for her scheduled visitation. Margaret, the supervisor, met her at the door with an apologetic expression. Mrs. Hartley, I'm sorry. The visitation has been canceled. What? Why? Mr. Hartley filed an emergency motion yesterday. He's claiming that you've been making threatening statements about him and his wife. The judge granted a temporary restraining order pending a hearing. You're not allowed within 500 feet of Mr. Hartley, Mrs. Hartley, or the children. That's insane. I never threatened anyone. The hearing is scheduled for next week. You'll have a chance to defend yourself. But until then, the restraining order stands. Claire stood in the parking lot, watching other families arrive for their visits, parents hugging children, tears and laughter and messy reunions. She couldn't even see her babies. That night, Claire sat in her childhood bedroom and took inventory. She had no money, no evidence, no access to her children. She was being sued for $2 million she didn't have. Her parents were bankrupted. Her lawyer was advising surrender. Preston Hartley had won. Completely, utterly, devastatingly. Claire's phone rang. It was Damien. I heard about the restraining order, he said. I'm sorry. It's over, Claire said, her voice hollow. He destroyed us. Not yet. Damien, we have nothing. He's taken everything. Not everything. We still have one thing Preston doesn't know about. What's that? Rage? Damien's voice was cold, controlled fury. Preston thinks he's won. He thinks you're beaten, so he's going to get sloppy. He's going to celebrate. And when he does, he's going to make a mistake. What kind of mistake? The kind that men like him always make when they think they're untouchable. They get greedy, they overreach, and when Preston overreaches, we'll be there to catch him. Claire wanted to believe him, but she was so tired, so broken. I need time to think, she said. She hung up and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she had to appear at the restraining order hearing. Preston's lawyers would present fabricated evidence of threats. The judge would believe them. Claire would be labeled an unstable ex-wife harassing her former family, and her children would grow up never knowing her. Sometimes, Claire thought, survival isn't about winning. Sometimes it's just about outlasting the pain long enough to see the next sunrise. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. The restraining order hearing was a massacre. Preston's lawyers presented text messages Claire had supposedly sent, threatening and unstable. She'd never written them, but the messages existed, sent from her phone number at times when she couldn't account for her exact whereabouts. Classic signs of post-traumatic psychological disturbance, their psychiatrist testified. Mrs. Hartley may not even remember sending these messages due to her brain injury. Claire's lawyer tried to argue the messages were fabricated, but without a forensic analysis they couldn't afford. It was her word against digital evidence. Judge Brennan extended the restraining order for 6 months. Claire walked out of the courthouse knowing she'd lost more than visitation. She'd lost credibility. Any future custody battle would be poisoned by this record of threatening behavior. The defamation lawsuit moved forward. Preston's lawyers offered a settlement. Claire would sign a non-disclosure agreement, admitting her statements about Hartley Pharmaceuticals were false, and agree never to investigate or speak about Preston again. In exchange, they'd reduce the damages to $500,000, payable over 10 years. It was extortion, but fighting would cost more and accomplish nothing. Susan advised acceptance. Sometimes survival means living to fight another day. But there wouldn't be another day. That was the point. Claire's parents' house was foreclosed on 3 months later. Frank and Eleanor moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Arizona, where the cost of living was cheaper. Claire stayed in Connecticut, working retail at a pharmacy for $11 an hour, living in a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and defeat. She saw her children once, by accident. She was walking past a park, carefully staying beyond the 500-foot restraining order boundary, when she spotted them. Ethan and Grace, now 18 months old. Walking, talking, playing. Grace was pushing a toy stroller. Ethan was running in circles, laughing. Savannah sat on a bench nearby, scrolling through her phone, barely watching them. Preston wasn't there, probably at the office, closing the pharmaceutical company's public offering. Hartley Pharmaceuticals had gone public 2 months earlier at a $3 billion valuation. Preston was now worth On paper, over $500 million. Claire watched from across the street. Grace stumbled and fell. Savannah didn't even look up. Grace cried for a moment, then got up and kept playing. That's when Claire saw it. The small detail that didn't fit. Grace's cry was hoarse, labored. She'd seen enough sick children in her brief retail pharmacy work to recognize a respiratory issue when she heard one. Grace was sick, and Savannah wasn't paying attention. Claire forced herself to walk away. The restraining order meant she couldn't approach, couldn't help, couldn't even call attention to what she'd seen without risking arrest. She went home to her studio apartment and cried until she vomited. That night, Damien called. He'd been quiet for months, presumably rebuilding his investigation. "We need to talk, in person." They met at a different diner, farther from Connecticut. Damien looked haggard, older than his 38 years. "I've spent 4 months trying to rebuild the evidence," he said without preamble. "I recovered some of the clinical trial data through backdoor FDA channels. I found 2 of the 12 families whose relatives died during Zentiva trials, but it's not enough. Without Dr. Walsh's testimony or the original emails, we can't prove Preston deliberately hid the deaths." Claire nodded. She'd expected this. "But I found something else," Damien continued. "Something bigger." He pulled out a folder, glanced around the empty diner, and slid it across the table. "Preston and Savannah aren't just covering up clinical trial deaths. They're embezzling from Hartley Pharmaceuticals. Millions of dollars funneled through shell companies and offshore accounts." Claire opened the folder. Bank statements, wire transfer records, corporate filings. "This is from before the company went public," Damien explained. "Preston used his position as CEO to create fake consulting contracts. Money goes out to shell companies, comes back to his personal accounts. Classic embezzlement scheme. Once the company went public, he stopped because SEC scrutiny got too intense. But the evidence is there. Why didn't the auditors catch it? They did. Look at this." Damien pointed to an internal audit report from 8 months ago. The company's accounting firm flagged irregular transactions, but Preston's CFO, a guy named Martin Fletcher, signed off on them as legitimate business expenses. Fletcher's complicit. "So we report it to the SEC. Already did, anonymously. They're investigating, but these things take time. Could be a year before charges are filed." A year, always a year. "There's more," Damien said. "Dr. Gerald Moss, the anesthesiologist from your surgery, I found his financial records. He received a $200,000 deposit 3 days after your twins were born, paid through one of Preston's shell companies." Claire's hands trembled. "Proof. That's proof he bribed Moss to keep me in a coma. It's proof of a payment. We'd need Moss to testify that it was a bribe, and he won't. He'd be admitting to attempted murder. Then we're back to nothing." "Not nothing. We have pieces. We just need one more domino to fall, one person to crack, one mistake from Preston." Claire looked at the evidence spread across the diner table. It was damning but incomplete, like a jigsaw puzzle missing the center pieces. Suggestive but not conclusive. "I'm tired," she said quietly. "I've been fighting for a year. I've lost my children, my home, my parents' savings. I work retail for minimum wage and live in an apartment where I can hear my neighbors fighting through the walls. And for what? For pieces of evidence that aren't enough." Damien reached across and took her hand. "For your children, for Ethan and Grace, so they grow up knowing their mother never stopped fighting for them. They won't know me. They call Savannah Mommy. They won't remember I exist. They will. When they're older, when they ask questions about their birth mother, they'll learn the truth. If we stop now, the story ends with you as the crazy ex-wife who harassed their father. If we keep going, even if we don't win everything, we might win enough to give them the truth." Claire pulled her hand back. "I need to think." She left the diner and drove aimlessly. She ended up at a church, one she'd attended as a child. It was late, but the doors were unlocked. She sat in a pew and stared at the altar. She wasn't religious anymore. Hadn't been for years. But she remembered what her mother used to say. Sometimes you have to fall all the way down before you can climb back up. Claire had fallen, hit bottom and kept falling. She was so far down she couldn't see the surface anymore. Her phone buzzed. A news alert. Hartley Pharmaceuticals announces merger with European biotech giant. Deal valued at $8 billion. $8 billion. Preston was now worth over $1 billion. And Claire was sitting in an empty church, contemplating surrender. She closed her eyes, pictured Grace falling in the park, crying with that labored, hoarse sound. Pictured Ethan's serious little face. Pictured them at 10, 15, 20 years old, asking about their birth mother and being told lies. Maybe Damien was right. Maybe the goal wasn't winning. Maybe it was just making sure her children knew, someday, that she'd never stop fighting. Claire stood up, walked out of the church, got in her car and drove back to her apartment. Tomorrow, she'd call Damien. They'd keep digging, keep building the case, keep waiting for Preston's mistake, because the alternative was accepting that monsters won, and Claire had already spent 6 months unconscious. She was done sleeping through her own life. 6 months passed. Claire worked her pharmacy job, attended court-mandated therapy to prove she wasn't a threat, and waited. Damien continued his investigation, building connections with federal prosecutors, compiling evidence of the embezzlement scheme. The SEC investigation into Hartley Pharmaceuticals moved at bureaucratic speed. Depositions were scheduled, then delayed. Subpoenas were issued, then challenged. Preston's lawyers were very good at creating procedural obstacles. But slowly pressure built. The SEC investigation became public knowledge. Hartley Pharmaceuticals' stock price dropped 15%. Shareholders filed lawsuits. Preston's billion-dollar merger with the European biotech company was put on hold pending the investigation's outcome. Preston was still winning, but for the first time, he was worried. Then, unexpectedly, Dr. Rebecca Walsh resurfaced. She called Damien from a blocked number. "I heard about the SEC investigation. I want to talk." Damien flew to Seattle, where Walsh was now living under a different name. She met him in a coffee shop, looking over her shoulder every few minutes. "Preston threatened me," she said without preamble. "After I raised concerns about the Zentiva trial deaths, he called me into his office. He said if I reported anything to the FDA, he'd destroy my career. He had dirt on me, personal things from my past. I got scared and took the buyout." "What kind of dirt?" "I had a prescription drug problem 10 years ago. I'd gotten clean, but Preston found the medical records. He threatened to leak them, claim I was currently using, destroy my medical license." "So you took money to stay quiet?" "Yes, $300,000 and a reference letter for a new job. I moved to Oregon, then to Seattle, but I've been watching the news. I see what he's doing. The cover-up is getting bigger. People are going to die from Zentiva, and I can't live with that." "Will you testify?" Walsh hesitated. "If you can protect me from retaliation, if you can guarantee my medical license won't be revoked for what I did." "I can't guarantee anything, but if you tell the truth, the FDA will have to act. Preston will face criminal charges. He won't have power to retaliate." Walsh agreed. Damien spent 3 days recording her testimony, gathering documents she'd secretly copied before leaving Hartley Pharmaceuticals, emails showing Preston's direct orders to hide adverse events, meeting notes where the cover-up was discussed openly. It was the breakthrough they needed. Damien compiled a new dossier, the embezzlement evidence, Walsh's testimony, the clinical trial deaths, and the bribe payment to Dr. Moss. He delivered it simultaneously to the FBI, the SEC, the FDA, and Connecticut state prosecutors. The coordinated law enforcement response was immediate. Federal agents raided Hartley Pharmaceuticals' headquarters, seizing servers and files. The SEC froze Preston's accounts pending investigation. The FDA issued an emergency suspension of Zentiva's approval process, and the Connecticut Attorney General announced criminal charges: securities fraud, wire fraud, falsifying federal documents, and conspiracy. Preston was arrested at his office. Savannah was arrested at the Greenwich Mansion. The news cycle exploded. Pharmaceutical CEO arrested in massive fraud scheme. Billionaire and wife face federal charges. Clinical trial cover-up endangered patients. Claire watched the news at her apartment, barely breathing. It was happening. After 18 months of hell, the system was finally working. But the children? Her children were at the West Mansion when Savannah was arrested. They were now with a temporary foster placement through Child Protective Services while the courts determined custody. Claire immediately petitioned for emergency custody. She was the biological mother, no longer under restraining order, never charged with any crime. The children should come to her. Preston's lawyers fought it even from jail. Mrs. Hartley is unemployed, lives in substandard housing, has documented mental health issues from her coma. The children should remain in foster care until Mr. Hartley resolves these baseless charges. The custody hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Damien used his connections to help Claire prepare. He secured a better apartment for her, helped her apply for better jobs, connected her with character witnesses. Claire's neurologist testified she'd made a full recovery. Her therapist testified she was mentally stable. But the children had been with Preston and Savannah for 20 months. They knew no other parents. The foster care system was hesitant to disrupt their lives again with another sudden placement. Judge Brennan, the same judge who denied Claire visitation 18 months ago, presided over the hearing. She looked older, wearier, like she'd seen too many cases like this. Mrs. Hartley, the judge said, I made a ruling 18 months ago that I now believe was influenced by fraudulent evidence presented by Mr. Hartley's legal team. For that, I apologize. However, the question before me now is not about past injustices. It's about what's best for Ethan and Grace going forward. Claire's lawyer stood. Your Honor, these children belong with their biological mother. Mrs. Hartley has been fighting for them since the day she woke from her coma. She's stable, employed, and has been vindicated of all accusations made against her. She's also a stranger to them. Preston's lawyer countered. They've been with their father their entire lives. Removing them to a small apartment with a mother they don't remember would be traumatic. Judge Brennan reviewed the case file. I'm ordering a graduated reunification plan. Mrs. Hartley will have supervised visitation 3 times per week for 1 month, then unsupervised visitation, then overnight visits. We'll reassess in 3 months. 3 months, not immediate custody, but a path forward. Claire accepted it. She'd learned patience through suffering. The first visit was in the same family services center where she'd lost access 18 months ago. Ethan and Grace were brought in by their foster mother. They were 2 years old now, talking in full sentences, their personalities emerging. They didn't know Claire, but unlike 18 months ago, Claire had a plan. She brought photo albums. I want to show you some pictures. This is me when I was pregnant with you. See, you were in my tummy. And this is the day you were born. See baby Ethan. See baby Grace. Grace studied the photos with intense concentration. That's me. That's you. And I'm your mommy, your first mommy. I got very sick after you were born, and I couldn't take care of you, but I'm better now, and I want to be part of your life. It was honest, age appropriate. The therapist supervising the visit nodded approval. Over the next 3 months, Claire built a relationship with her children. Slowly, carefully, she became less of a stranger. She learned that Grace loved art and Ethan loved building things. She learned their favorite foods, their fears, their quirks. They didn't call her Mommy yet, but Grace started calling her Mama Claire, and Ethan would sometimes reach for her hand. Preston's trial moved through the system. He pleaded not guilty, claimed he was being framed by disgruntled employees and his vengeful ex-wife. But the evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Walsh's testimony was damning. The financial records were clear. The cover-up was documented in Preston's own emails. Savannah took a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Preston in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, how they'd planned to keep Claire in a coma indefinitely, how they'd bribed doctors, falsified records, and destroyed evidence. Preston was convicted on 14 federal charges. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison. Savannah received 15 years for her cooperation. 6 months after their arrest, Claire was granted full custody of Ethan and Grace. The transition was gradual, with therapy and support. The children struggled with the changes, grieving the only parents they remembered while learning to love the mother they didn't. It wasn't a fairy tale. Grace had nightmares. Ethan had behavioral issues, pushing boundaries and testing whether Claire would abandon him too. They were in family therapy twice a week, but they were hers. Finally, legally, permanently hers. 3 years after waking from her coma, Claire stood in her new apartment, watching Ethan and Grace play. She'd returned to law, working at a family rights organization, helping other parents navigate custody battles and medical incompetency cases. Damien visited often. Uncle Damien to the twins. He'd officially resumed his real identity. His witness protection successfully ended with the conviction of his former partners. "You did it," Damien said, watching the children play. "You survived," Claire nodded. "We all survived, but we're all scarred." Grace ran up, holding a drawing. "Mama Claire, look what I made." It was a picture of their family. Claire, Ethan, Grace, and Damien, stick figures holding hands under a bright sun. Claire hugged her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the solid reality of her presence. They'd buried her. They didn't know she was a seed. 5 years after the trial, Claire received a letter. It was from Preston, written from federal prison. She almost threw it away unread, but something made her hesitate. The letter was short. "Claire, I know I have no right to ask for anything from you. I destroyed your life, nearly killed you, and stole years you should have spent with our children. I tell myself I was protecting my business, that Savannah manipulated me, that I didn't understand the consequences. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I was a coward who chose money over human life. I chose ego over love. Every day in here, I think about what I took from you and from Ethan and Grace. This isn't an apology because words can't undo what I did. This is just an acknowledgement. You won because you were stronger than me. You won because you never stopped fighting. And our children are lucky to have you. Preston." Claire read it twice, then filed it away. Not forgiven, but acknowledged. Some things couldn't be reconciled, only survived. Ethan and Grace were 7 now. They knew the truth, delivered in age-appropriate stages through therapy. They knew their father was in prison. They knew their stepmother had helped hurt their mother. They knew their early childhood was complicated in ways most kids weren't. Grace still had occasional nightmares. Ethan still had trust issues. But they were also funny, smart, creative children who loved dinosaurs and art and building elaborate block cities. They had friends, hobbies, a mother who showed up to every school event. They called Claire Mom now. Not Mama Claire, just Mom. Claire had rebuilt her law career, specializing in medical custody cases. She fought for parents who'd been declared incompetent, who'd lost children to ex-spouses with better lawyers, who'd survived medical emergencies only to find their lives dismantled. She won more cases than she lost. And when she lost, she made sure her clients knew they'd fought the good fight, that survival itself was a victory. Damien had become part of their family. He taught Ethan chess and helped Grace with math homework. He'd never married, never had children of his own. Claire suspected he loved her. Maybe always had, but neither of them acted on it. What they had was more important than romance. They were survivors together, bound by shared trauma and hard-won victories. On the 5th anniversary of Claire waking from her coma, she took Ethan and Grace to a park. Not the Greenwich Park where she'd once watched them from across the street, forbidden to approach. A different park, in a different town, where they could play without ghosts. Grace was on the swings, pumping her legs, hair flying. Ethan was building an elaborate stick fort near a tree. Normal children doing normal things. A woman on a nearby bench watched them, smiling. "They're beautiful. How old? 7? Claire said. "Twins." "Twins? That must be challenging." "It has its moments." Claire smiled. It was a normal conversation, the kind mothers had at parks. No one here knew her story. To them, she was just another mom, maybe a little more watchful than most, but normal enough. Grace jumped off the swing and ran over. "Mom, can we get ice cream after?" "Sure, sweetie." Grace ran back to play, and the other mother said, "They seem like happy kids." Claire nodded. "They are. We've been through some tough times, but we made it through together." The other mother smiled and returned to watching her own children. The conversation ended, ordinary and forgettable. But to Claire, then, it was extraordinary. She was having a normal day at a park with her children. Something so simple, so mundane, that most people never thought twice about it. She'd spent 6 months in a coma, 18 months fighting for custody, years rebuilding trust with children who'd been raised by their father and his mistress. And now, finally, she had normal days. That evening, after ice cream and dinner and bedtime stories, Claire stood in the doorway of the twins' room, watching them sleep. Ethan was sprawled across his bed, blankets kicked off. Grace clutched her stuffed rabbit, the same one from that first supervised visit 5 years ago. They were safe. They were loved. They were hers. Claire's phone buzzed. A text from Damien. "How was your day?" She replied, "Normal. Perfect normal." He sent back a simple thumbs-up emoji. Claire closed the children's door softly and went to her own room. She had work tomorrow, cases to prepare. A client whose ex-husband was using medical records to claim incompetency. Claire would fight for her the way Damien had fought for Claire, because she'd learned something through her ordeal. Winning wasn't about getting everything back. It wasn't about perfect justice or complete restoration. Sometimes winning was just surviving long enough to have normal days, to watch your children play at parks, to have boring conversations with strangers, to build a small, imperfect life on the ruins of what was stolen. They'd tried to bury her, and they didn't know she was a seed. But even seeds that survive carry the scars of the burial. The tree that grows is shaped by the weight of the dirt that tried to crush it. Claire was shaped by what she'd survived. Harder, maybe, more vigilant, unable to fully trust the way she once had. She'd never be the woman she was before the coma. That Claire was gone, buried with the old life. This Claire was different, scarred but standing, broken but rebuilt. Not the same, but maybe stronger in the places that had shattered. She thought about Preston's letter. He'd called her stronger than him, but that wasn't quite right. She wasn't stronger. She was just more desperate. When you have nothing left to lose, you can fight without fear. When your children are at stake, surrender isn't an option. Preston had everything to lose, so he fought dirty. Claire had already lost everything, so she fought with the reckless courage of someone who'd touched bottom and found it solid enough to push off from. In the end, that made all the difference. Claire got ready for bed, set her alarm, and checked the locks on the doors twice. A habit from the years of fear. She'd probably never break it. Before turning off the light, she looked at the photo on her nightstand. Her, Ethan, and Grace at the beach last summer. All three of them smiling, building a sandcastle. Grace's drawing from therapy was framed next to it. The stick figure family holding hands. This was her life now. Not perfect, but real. Not what she'd imagined at 33 when she married Preston, but maybe better in its own way. Born from trauma, but rooted in truth, she turned off the light and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she'd wake up and fight for another mother's children. She'd help Ethan with his science project and take Grace to art class. She'd have coffee with Damien and discuss his latest forensic accounting case. She'd live the small, imperfect, precious life she'd fought so hard to reclaim. And if anyone ever tried to take it from her again, she'd be ready, because she'd learned the most important lesson. Some victories don't feel like winning. Some justice comes too late to heal all wounds. Some families are built from broken pieces that never quite fit back together perfectly. But survival, real survival, isn't about restoration. It's about transformation. Taking what's left and building something new. Something scarred, but standing. Something that knows darkness, but chooses light anyway. Claire had survived. Her children were safe. And tomorrow, she'd wake up and survive again. That was enough.